Healthcare organizations are flooded with data, but anyone who's ever been a patient knows they don't always make the best use of it. What would it take to unlock the potential and provide personalized insights to drive better medical decision making and outcomes? Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the Health Biz podcast, where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. My guest today is Bradley Bostic, founder and CEO of hc1. His family medical strategy sparked a drive to change healthcare for the better. Do you like this show? If so, please subscribe and leave a review. Bradley, welcome to the Health Biz podcast.
Hey, David, it's great to be here.
We're going to talk about all sorts of great stuff that you're doing now, but I want to wind the clock back and talk a little bit about your background, your upbringing. What was your childhood like?
Well, I was fortunate to be born in the great state of South Dakota and a small town called Brookings, South Dakota, home of the South Dakota State Jackrabbits, which is where my father and mother attended college. And so, the people that I grew up with were just really hardworking, nice Midwestern type people. And as my dad progressed through his jobs and his promotions in banking, we would move to other cities. So we lived in Sioux Falls, we lived in Omaha, and then ultimately I attended Indiana University where I studied business and computer information systems.
Now, do they actually have a lot of jackrabbits running around, or is that just supposed to be an inspiration for the sports teams?
There are absolutely some jackrabbits running around. Yeah, if you go out on the prairie, you'll see them, and some of them are pretty darn big.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's not just not just kind of a sidebar. It's part of the mainstream or the jackrabbits. They're everywhere. Sometimes
yeah.
you wonder if they might overtake the whole state. But
It,
yeah,
it could be concerning. We have some little bunnies around here, and I think it came when someone decided it was not a good idea to have coyotes around, but may need to invite the
oh,
coyotes
okay.
back. Yeah. All right.
Makes sense.
So what was it like in Indiana University?
It was outstanding. Probably the biggest thing that happened that I was really fortunate. I'd always been into technology and computers and had been kind of a hobbyist with writing programs and got involved with the early embodiment of the internet with telnetting and was always
Yeah.
just amazed by what the possibilities were before there ever was an easy way to access the internet. And then while I was at IU, I remember one of the summers I went back to campus and I went into a computer lab, and all of a sudden, every computer in the computer lab had Netscape on it. And that was the moment where I thought, wow, this changes everything because now even a layperson who's not technical at all can access content or connect with other people by using this browser. So that's probably the most memorable aspect of my college. I did also play football on the Indiana University football team.
Nice.
So very excited to see that they are 5-0 for the first time in
Yeah.
quite a while this year. Yep.
That's pretty good. Well, I assume your nickname was Jackrabbit, so you don't have to respond to that. But that's not really a
Actually,
football nickname. Yeah.
no, it was, I mean, my nickname was kind of Boom Bostic in that,
Yeah.
I think I mentioned when we were doing the early call here, I'm launching a new podcast called Boom Bostic Health. So I'd love to
Nice.
have you as a guest once we get up and running.
That'll be good. That'll be good. Well, there's some good elements of your name, I'll say, which we'll be getting to shortly. So Ernst and Young, though, after you graduated, right? Was that first job there?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I just felt like I would be remiss if I didn't go work for a great organization like that. They extended an offer to me, even though I had started a company while I was in college already that was more of an e-commerce company. I felt like getting some experience in a big consulting firm would be helpful, and it really was. I went through all the training, learned how they approached their methodology for consulting, met a lot of great people who to this day I still connect with, and it's kind of wild how you fast forward 20 years or so, and somebody will pop up and you'll say, "Hey, we were at Ernst and Young together." But also while I was there, I started to get a behind the scenes look at how healthcare functioned and how the different silos were set up, and started to understand the incentive systems that existed, and that ultimately was a major catalyst for me getting into the healthcare industry and staying there, throughout my career.
So I don't know if this was the company you're talking about, but got a company, Boss Tech, which I would have known, I guess, Boss Tech, And the question is
Bostic, yeah.
does boss stand for Boston, or you're the boss and the tech? I mean, how'd you come up with that name, Boss Tech?
Yeah, well, it was just really not all that imaginative. I was like, well, I'm starting to do consulting in the technology industry, and my last name's Bostic, and just changed that slightly to Boss Tech. I do remember there was a roster. I was certainly nowhere near like the star status in my college football career, and I had a roster came out. I think it was in the spring, and they had mistyped my last name as Boss Tech,
Nice.
actually. And I thought, gosh, that's got a nice ring to it. So fast forward a few years, and I ended up with a company called that, and that was kind of what we called home as I started getting into the healthcare industry early on.
Got it. All right. So the next company I have another connection with. So Cha Cha. So Cha Cha, before you explain what it is from your standpoint, when I was little, my grandmother had a French poodle named Cha Cha. And I think it was inherited from my aunt, who like left home and left her with this little dog to walk around. It used to soil the rug. That's what I remember about it, little dog Cha Cha. So that's not what your Cha Cha was
Oh,
doing,
that's
though.
all. That's a terrible connotation.
I'm
Well,
sorry.
man, I don't love that dog. Yeah, so the idea was really, now that we look back, a pretty revolutionary idea. And it was that the state of accessing information at that time, this was back in like 2005, was that you would go on to Google, or I think Yahoo still existed back then too, but
Yeah.
you would do a search and get a whole bunch of potential results. And my co-founder and I, a guy named Scott Jones, who was kind of a mentor for me early in my career. And he had actually invented network-based voicemail and started a company called Boston Technology. So he was an older, accomplished entrepreneur that sort of took me under his wing early on. And he and I came up with this concept for what if you could ask any question on your mobile phone and actually get the answer back instead of
Yeah.
having a whole list of results. And so it was similar to the concept of a chat GPT, or, these large language models that are out there now. You could go onto your mobile phone and text the question, because at that time, apps weren't really very common yet. And there wasn't the voice front end like Siri or those kinds of capabilities built into your phone. So you could text your question to 242242, which is spells cha-cha on the old school,
Nice.
keys, and we would send an answer back. And it was really cool because it was a combination of artificial intelligence and human intelligence. So if the algorithm could answer your question with high confidence, it would automatically do that. And it would feel like a really smart friend was in your phone. If the algorithm couldn't do it, it would route your question to a community member who could actually then go answer your question. So we had about 28 million monthly unique users when I left that company. It was a little bit ahead of its time, and there were a few things that didn't go perfectly well, but it was a heck of a learning experience. And we had so many great people on our team that built that. And to this day, I apply a lot of concepts to what I do with the data that we go through in healthcare to try to generate the ultimate end results that are going to make healthcare better, that I learned back in that business. But that was kind of the one thing I did that was not specifically healthcare,
Got it.
but it were technologies there that certainly play a role, and frankly got me into the whole AI concept way early relative to the rest of the market.
Oh, that's good. So I see a bunch of kind of healthcare related things coming up after that as I try to understand and interpret your LinkedIn. Maybe I should have used artificial intelligence to have it, explain it to me what was going
Yeah.
on there.
If
But
you
what
had just
was,
asked Chat GPT, it would have
yeah,
laid it all out.
I should have done that. So what after Chacha, what were you doing then?
Yeah, well, my career has been somewhat multi-threaded, so there isn't necessarily a
Got
perfectly
it.
serial chronology. But
No problem.
in the mix there, I was involved with a genomics lab that provided capabilities to ensure that when you get a biopsy done that results in a diagnosis, that it's actually your tissue that the biopsy was done on, because there's a pretty substantial
Yeah.
single digit, like whole number percentage switching error or contamination rate in biopsies. So I was involved with that company. And then I also had a teleradiology company that provided, remote radiology services, primarily to rural hospitals. and folks that couldn't have their own on-site subspecialty radiology, so brought better care in that way. And then ultimately got to the point where I started to understand the data flows in healthcare well enough that I said, man, why is it that 80+% of all diagnostic decisions are made based on laboratory data, yet the lab isn't really leveraged as a strategic asset for the healthcare system or for payers? And that led to starting a project called Health Cloud One, which is now called HC1. And I'm the chairman and CEO of that company. And then I've also gone on to start a fund where it's all closely held companies, but we've got three businesses in our portfolio. HC1 is one of those, which is laboratory data focused. We've got a company called 3Aware, which is medical device data focused. And then we have a company called Decision RX, which is pharmaceutical data focused to help get patients on the optimal medication. So that's the world that I currently occupy and have sort of created, but I run day to day our company HC1, which is by far the leader in laboratory analytics.
Got it. Okay. So Decision RX, we featured on the podcast before. I'll leave a link to that so people can listen to that. And let's focus a little bit on HC1. So as an interesting insight about how a lot of the diagnosis, the majority of it is coming from, these diagnostic tests, the lab, and yet the lab is really just kind of an afterthought. It's like ancillary is even how they refer to it. So what does it mean to then go from that? How do you take that realization and then turn it into a thriving business?
Well, first of all, there are two major categories of laboratory. One is what I would call an independent commercial lab that is not owned by a hospital or health system. So, like a LabCorp or a Quest or Sonic Healthcare, there are a variety of these, lots of these independent laboratories, and they have their own sets of issues and opportunities. But then you have more of the hospital and health system owned labs. And because they aren't necessarily out there branding themselves in a way that would make you identify with the lab as a hospital lab, the bulk of laboratory testing that's done nationally is done by actual hospital or health system owned labs. I think the last stat I saw was around 20% is done by the two largest labs, and then the rest is kind of sprinkled out throughout the other folks and then the health systems. So where do you begin? Well, first of all, the lab is connected to every single health journey, no matter what your situation is, whether you're healthy or you're sick or you're somewhere in between, you will have lab testing run, and that will generate data. Now, typically that data only gets utilized at a specific moment in time where the doctor's trying to decide, do you need some kind of medication or something? But once that happens, it tends to get stored in a record and not really considered very much in the future. There's also the issue in that reality that doctors are very busy, their staff is very busy. The state of the art in laboratory testing continues to evolve. So ensuring that you have the right testing done, not only the tests that are required, but also not doing the tests that shouldn't be done, that's a whole big challenge in and of itself. So
Yeah.
one of the places that HC1 begins on their journey with healthcare systems that have these laboratories that are like the lifeblood of the health system is to ensure that that testing is being performed in an optimal way. And the general term that's used in the industry is lab stewardship, but
Yeah.
it's how do I make sure that patients are getting the right test at the right time? And, patients don't show up in your office all the time proactively. You might have somebody who has indicators that they could be pre-diabetic, for example, that you should be testing them on a routinized basis. But you're busy, they're busy, you don't necessarily do all that follow up. So that's the starting point, really, is let's make sure patients are effectively diagnosed using the best testing. And then, as it turns out, when you do that, care delivery is less expensive. So that's better for the payers. and better for the hospitals themselves and better for the patients. Uh, and the reason it's less expensive is because patients are healthier. So you diagnose somebody effectively with the right tests, you eliminate wasteful testing. There's a very virtuous outcome that occurs when that happens. And then there are lots of layers under that in terms of the operational aspects of how labs actually do their jobs. But a simple way to think about it is if your loved one shows up at the hospital and they are sick and you're trying to figure out what's wrong with them, as my son did. My son had pneumonia this last year and had these symptoms that were very concerning. Getting him diagnosed as quickly as possible was critical, right? I mean, it was everything that mattered in the world. So think about how if you could have the optimal lab testing model that ensured every single one of those people's loved ones across the entire continuum, you knew was getting the optimized test to get to the best possible result. It's a pretty big game changer for healthcare, and that's a huge focus that HC1 has.
Got it. So I was sort of surprised to see the term applied personalized diagnostic testing, because after all, when you're doing a test, you're just testing one person at a time typically. Why do we need to have why do we need to go beyond just testing and say personalized?
Yeah, I think it's because this one size fits all approach to diagnostic testing can oftentimes leave people undiagnosed or underdiagnosed or even misdiagnosed. And a lot of times that's because a given test that exists, that specific panel that's used by the hospital might not even contemplate all the possible options that are out there. And certainly personalized is a can be a loaded term as well, right? Because everybody thinks about it a different way, and precision is the one that's the most loaded because everybody just thinks about
Yeah,
oncology, like that's what precision means. But yeah, it's about both for like when I started HC1, it was how can we make sure the right patient gets the right test so they're diagnosed effectively, and then ultimately the right therapy, which usually comes in the form of some kind of medication. And actually, DecisionRx exists as a result of that because we created a whole company to go solve that right prescription step. But for HC1, ensuring that you get diagnosed effectively, it is about that individual. Like we have a way in our data where we can identify people, for example, who are highly predisposed or showing indications of um, developing CKD, chronic kidney disease. And if you engage those people in the right kind of follow-up testing that's personalized, to them, it's not
yeah.
just treating them like one of the mass, it's treating them as an individual. You can then get them on a pathway to avoid a catastrophic, system failure that results in very bad outcomes as well as big costs. So does that help answer the question?
Yeah,
And
no,
what do we mean
absolutely,
by personalized?
yeah, that does help. And then you mentioned before having a lot of data around that's typically just used once or to make one decision, but it lends itself certainly to modern techniques like machine learning. And what are you doing with this large data set? How does some technique like machine learning come into it?
Yeah, so there is so much to be gleaned from looking at data longitudinally instead of just in these silos. And not only is the laboratory data issue that data tends to be siloed within a given or health system or a given clinic, but it's even worse than that insofar as many of the medical record systems don't really do longitudinal analysis automatically on that laboratory data. It's just stored somewhere as a bunch of test codes. And so we are applying machine learning and natural language understanding, various capabilities that fall under this broad, AI umbrella to ensure that we can become more and more predictive about what's coming. And that even gets to the point in some cases of very advanced data science, like we can now identify which individual patients are most predisposed to develop cognitive decline in the future based on routinized, sort of routine laboratory tests that you get at a physical. So there's so much you can do by identifying these patterns using the technology that you really can't do with people. There's just not enough time in the day, and it's too hard to correlate these different data points. So I think the opportunities are endless to make it so that based on laboratory insights, you can start identifying these issues way in advance and become much more proactive and preventative. And frankly, I think it's way easier and better to prevent some kind of future issue by identifying it in the lab data than it is by trying to get a patient to do a lot of other things to, more screenings or, there's just this, I think the future is very bright as it relates to using machine learning and other data science to unearth signals in this data that can prevent future issues so that you can manage the care of your patients proactively.
It sounds like it'd be very valuable for patients, and yet in healthcare, that's usually not who the customer is. Who's the customer here? Or do you have multiple customers across, I don't know, the patient, the provider, pharmacy, pharmaceutical companies, payer? How does this all play in to work economically?
Yeah, so hc1's core customer base is really the provider side of healthcare. And they can be challenging to work with in the health system world or in the actual commercial laboratories. But once we get engaged, the value we deliver from the data that's generated is 10x what was happening before. So we tend to have these long-term partnerships with these clients. Now, the patients are benefiting in a very direct way, but we're not directly working with patients or calling on patients as a client. And then ultimately, we also do enable our health system clients in certain cases to have collaborative kinds of arrangements that tie into the pharma world. Because if you think about how you can accelerate clinical trials by more quickly and effectively identifying patients that need certain treatments that maybe they can't get access to, or how you can identify patients that have rare diseases where there's some unique medication that the doctor might not even know about. Those kinds of capabilities exist as part of the overarching mission of hc1 because it's all about not just diagnosing people, but how do we get them well and how do we collapse the sort of time it takes to go from identification of diagnosis to that treatment. Part of that ends up being you have to develop new treatments because we haven't solved everything yet.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on this show talking to entrepreneurs, CEOs who are doing something significant in healthcare, and they're touching a big part of it. There's a lot of this going on in the U.S., and at the same time, the latest Commonwealth Fund report showed what it's been showing for 20 years, which is that this country spends the most on healthcare and also has the worst health system performance. Now, I know some of how you came to healthcare relates to personal tragedy in your family. A lot of us have that, but it's sort of it's systemic. And I'm wondering, is it inevitable? And with the work that you're doing, like, is there a chance to actually address it, or we'll just be seeing the same Commonwealth report for the next 20 years also?
Yeah, yeah. So to that point, I watched my mom go through stage 4 cancer treatment and surgery and all that process at a world-class healthcare institution, and the experience was incredibly disjointed. But I will say the healthcare practitioners that were involved were very committed and incredibly smart. So it was sort of like the operating system that they were sitting on wasn't helping them coordinate with each other, but they individually were doing some really fantastic things. So there wasn't, it was kind of a weird disconnect between the different facets. I think the answer is way too long to fully explore in this kind of a format. But I will say at a high level, for one, I do believe that incentive drives behavior. And I think that when you have a healthcare paradigm that is very fee for service heavy, it is tough to align the incentives of the physician with the patient. That's sort of self-evident, I'd say, and that's why there's such a push to move to value-based healthcare delivery. What is that stat, David, on how much of the payments Medicare wants to have shifted over to value-based care by like 2035 or
Yeah, well,
whatever?
they want to have essentially everybody in a value-based care arrangement. That doesn't necessarily mean that every decision for every patient as being in that framework. They still may have a lot of fee for service within that, but essentially they want as much as possible to move in that direction. And it's partly the progress in that is partly impeded just by the ability to do it in terms of what data and analysis is available. They like to do as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is the caregivers have more demand for their services than what they have time to provide. And so I think that's where technology can come in as an enabler to allow caregivers to operate at the top of their license. So if you are qualified to provide some really highly specialized thing, how do we make it so all these other things underneath that that you waste your time on, where other way, that could get performed by technology, that's getting done. And I think, we talk about AI, and I actually did a keynote speech a couple of years ago where I referenced the 2001: A Space Odyssey and HAL 9000, and the
Yeah,
if you recall, like HAL 9000 is the supercomputer on board that is taking this crew into deep space, and it's this very promising new thing. Well, then they go through this energy field. HAL 9000 goes haywire and decides the only answer is to kill off the crew because he can't fulfill his mission.
yeah,
And so, you recall the quote, what do you think you're doing, Dave?
yeah,
When they're trying to unplug Hal. So
yeah,
anyway, for anybody who wants to watch that movie, it's incredibly prophetic, and it was created in the '60s, which is even more insane. But in any event, I think as it relates to the application of these advanced technologies like AI into healthcare, in my estimation, that doesn't replace the humans anytime soon, and maybe never. I think what it does do is it allows every human that is in the process of delivering healthcare to operate at a level where they're as close to as possible to the very best. So, and you say, look, there's whenever you go to a doctor, there's a possibility that that doctor graduated last in their class.
yeah,
I mean, it's not all people are created equally. Not everybody's as smart as the other person or as attentive. But if we could use enabling technologies to get everybody up to that top level and cut out a lot of the burden so you can spend more energy on the things that really make the impact. So I think getting the right incentives in line and getting people to where they've got the enablement. Then, frankly, some of the technologies that have been implemented have caused healthcare to get worse. When
yeah,
you go from a doctor who's sitting down talking to you, focused on you, making some notes, to a doctor who's sitting here, tapping away on an iPad, like that's not a great experience.
yeah,
So I think there's a lot. It's a target rich environment. With all that said, though, I will say I have not studied exactly how those reports are tabulated or what inputs are being used. But I also have a fair amount of experience with healthcare around the world. We've done a lot of business in the UK and Europe, for example, and some in Canada. And you do not have the horror stories in the States that you have in some of those other markets where it takes like 6 months to get, a critical surgery scheduled. So something, is still happening that's working here,
yeah.
but I think there are a lot of ways we can make it better.
Well, as a Dave, I'm glad that Hal's not taking over this year, so that'll be good. Now, you've done a lot of businesses, a lot of startups, a lot of investing. But as you mentioned briefly earlier in this podcast, you're starting your own podcast. So what's behind that, and how's that gonna work?
Yeah, so I get to spend time with a lot of fantastic people in the course of my work, similar to how you do. And I see people that have input and ideas and also analysis that's very relevant, that can help with advancing healthcare by making sure that the business of healthcare continues to be improved. So we decided to create Boom Bostic Health in order to feature those kinds of thoughts and ideas, really centered on the kinds of people that are really driving the positive change, or the kinds of people that can bring the critical analysis to the table to help other people do more of that. So investors that we work with, people who are building innovative companies and are entrepreneurial, executives who lead some of the most, I'd say, um, proactive and progressive healthcare systems, or payer organizations. In one of our early episodes, I've got a business partner that I helped start up a generative AI company focused on the pharma industry that he's the CEO of, and really interesting fellow who was an Olympic pole vaulter from Australia. So,
Nice.
it's like, and I love the stories, right? And I love hearing your story as we were, chatting earlier today. But that's what it's about. It's about bringing stories out there that also have a positive impact on the business of healthcare and maybe help demystify it a little bit.
Great. Well, last question for you. In addition to helping people tell the stories, I don't know if you have any time to read any books. If there's any books that you might recommend for our audience, or recommend not to waste your time on.
Yeah, I recently read, there are a couple that I'll mention that are just off the top of my head. One I just have reread recently that I just think is an awesome book for anybody aspiring to accomplish greatness in business in general. And that is a book by Jim Collins called Great by Choice. And Jim has a variety of books, a series, but Great by Choice is about this study of what is the common thread of, if there is one, that every company that has become a major breakthrough success has exhibited. And going in, usually you would guess they had some really good luck. And what the study identifies is that it's actually those companies that get their best return on luck, both good and bad. And so that's a great book. And then there's another one I just recently listened to while I was traveling. I like to do Audible when it's not
Yeah.
convenient to actually sit and read. And maybe the best part of it was the narrator was the author, which is Arnold Schwarzenegger's most recent book called Be Useful. And his father would tell him growing up, whatever you do, just be useful. And so hearing him actually read the book, because he's got that
Yeah.
incredibly well-known accent was awesome. Those are two suggestions.
Sounds good. I appreciate that. Well, Bradley Bostic, founder and CEO of hc1, thanks for joining me today on the Health Biz Podcast.
Thanks, David.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.